Hello everyone, today we're going to be talking about the prehistoric Aegean, and it's going to lead us into early ancient Greece. So to begin with, what is the Aegean? Well, that word, the Aegean, refers to this part of the world which you'll probably associate most strongly with Greece, which is over here. So today we're going to start by talking actually not about the artwork of Greece, which is most famous and most well known, but with the artwork of the Cycladic Islands, which is this little area of islands right over here. I should begin also by saying that the people of this region are seafaring, they are traders. For the most part, not too much is known about the prehistoric peoples of this region, although they did leave behind examples of monumental architecture. And, most famously, the Cycladic figurines. So we're going to look at the small geometric marble statues that are surviving from the Cycladic Islands, and the truth is, not much is known about these at all. They're very mysterious, just like a lot of prehistoric art, and they mark the beginning of Greek sculpture. You'll probably associate marble statues when you think of ancient Greek art, and that's only the end of a very long-standing tradition. The earliest figurative marble statues from this region looked something like this. Look at the one on the right. I've included in here on the upper left a picture of a painting by Picasso because I want you to notice how strongly the artwork of this region influences so much of the artwork and culture of the Western world. So I'll be just constantly trying to draw in some reminders. So the Cycladic figures are almost all female. The male figures are far fewer in number, and most of the male figures are playing instruments. They're, for the most part, small and relatively flat because these figures were included in burials. They were often placed directly on top of the people who had died. And they're very, very old. Why is there such a tradition of figurative sculpture in this region? We're not really sure, but the way that the people of the Aegean and of ancient Greece treated the figure and interacted with the human body has come to influence a lot of Western culture. And marble, too, was naturally occurring in this region, so we'll find that it's used not only for sculpture, but also later in architecture. Moving on to Crete. Crete was another island in the Aegean, but a slightly larger island. The Cyclades are a group of very small islands, but Crete is much larger. And the most famous archaeological site of Crete is the Palace of Knossos. I have here a map of the palace plan, and it's very, very intricate. When archaeologists first found it, it reminded them of the labyrinth of the Minotaur. Some of you might be familiar with the myth. The myth that is associated with this palace is the Minotaur, which is a monster, half human and half bull, was trapped inside of a labyrinth, a maze, and he was fed humans, specifically virgins, until he was killed by the hero Theseus. So this is an ancient Greek myth that was associated with this palace because of its complexity. The people that built the palace did have written language, but archaeologists have not been able to decipher it. So much of the history of this region and the details of the artifacts that they left behind, for example this one here, are unknown. They're a complete mystery. I include this image because I really like it, and also because it speaks very well of the people from Crete. The people from Crete were not warrior people. All of their artwork seems to be very peaceful. A lot of it features women and or animals. Here's what's called a snake goddess, although since we can't read their language, we don't really know what this figurine was used for. And she's holding two snakes and has maybe a cat on top of her head, which speaks of a strong connection to the natural world. From this region too, we see some of the first examples of foreshortening, and on this slide I don't necessarily want you to memorize this image, but I want you to understand what foreshortening is. Foreshortening is a system of problem solving and visual representation where the figure isn't just, or whatever you're drawing, in this case it's a figure, but it could be a landscape. It's not just a flattened view that shows the most important parts, which is what we think of when we think of ancient Egyptian depictions for the most part, for example, where all the figures are shown with their most prominent sides showing. But with foreshortening, it's drawn realistically. So look at this shoulder here. You see how it's seen from the side, and you get this side view of this man's ribs. This is a prime example of foreshortening, and some of the earliest foreshortening that we see. This is a very famous image from that palace of Knossos, the one that's associated with the myth of the Minotaur. And you can see that the people of Crete were very fascinated by bulls because they're oftentimes featured in their artwork. Even though we can't read their language, it seems that this ritual of bull leaping, jumping across a bull, was very much a part of their culture. And I find these early depictions of bulls really interesting because we still have such a strong tradition in this part of the world, but especially a little further north, I'm thinking Spain, of human-bull interactions. It seems to speak of maybe some sort of ancient ritual that was never forgotten. I mean, think even back to the cave paintings, and we always see bulls featured. Another thing to note here is that the figure that's a little bit darker is male because his skin is tan, but these two pale figures are female, and women are featured very strongly in the work of ancient Crete. Moving forward, I want to mention the ancient poet Homer, whom some of you might have heard of. Now this is a modern depiction of him here, this carving that I've included. Homer is a semi-mythological figure since we don't have any direct accounts from him because he lived in the 8th century BC, so very, very old. He was believed to have been blind and to have wandered around reciting poems that he had committed to memory. These two poems that he most famously wrote are called the Iliad and the Odyssey. You may have heard of them. They tell the story of the voyage to war and the return home of a hero named Odysseus. These two poems have influenced a lot of Western culture, and as a result, archaeologists and scholars are still fascinated with ancient Greece. And this fascination led to a lot of focus and interest in the ancient art of this region. So when you wonder why so much of this might look familiar, or why so many archaeologists specialize in the artwork of the ancient Greece and the Aegean, a lot of that has to do with the lasting cultural impact of the things that they built. This here is from Mycenae, and Mycenae is on the Greek mainland. Its excavation was led by Heinrich Schliemann, a German guy who was obsessed with Homer and wanted to find the cities that are mentioned in his poems. He was more or less successful, and he found this here. This is the citadel at Mycenae, and what's so notable about it is its enormous size and the way it was built. When this was first built, the archaeologists that found it said it looked like it had been built by a cyclops. A cyclops is another mythological creature. It's a giant monster with only one eye, because it seems to be built on a scale that's so much larger than life. Look at how small that figure is. What's interesting about it is that we see some of the earliest examples of different ways of making a passage in Mycenae. So the Greeks are very skilled architects in a way that we haven't quite seen before. We see many examples of the post and lintel, which is the most simple form of building an arch. It kind of looks like Stonehenge, right? And then a slight complication on that, the corbelled arch, which was this here. It's kind of a triangle shape, oftentimes above a post and lintel for added strength. And then we have what's called a true arch here on the bottom, which is a curve that's held into place with all of the static force that's exerted on the keystone, which is this center piece here. So I want you to be able to identify these three most basic methods of making a passageway, because you'll see them again and again. Here's a map. I just don't want you to start getting too confused. So that was Crete. That was this island here. Was where we saw the palace that was associated with the labyrinth. These are the Cycladic Islands, where those geometric marble figurative sculptures were found. We were just here in Mycenae, which is on the mainland. And now we're going to be looking at more artwork, mostly from the mainland. I'm going to just mention this, but I don't want you to get confused, and that's why we're going to start talking about this right now. A lot of the artwork of ancient Greece will look like artwork you associate with ancient Rome. That's because the Romans were highly influenced by the Greeks. However, they are two completely separate cultures, and the Greek artifacts almost always, in every case, are older and come first. And where is Rome? Rome is up here. It's in Italy. So this is Italy, this is Greece. Don't get confused. Okay. And here it is, the written version of what I just said. So ancient Greece and ancient Rome are two different things. I know they look similar and there's a lot of cultural interchange, but don't get confused. Ancient Greece comes first, and I know I know they're similar, right? So this trajectory of ancient Greek culture that extends into Rome is often referred to as classical antiquity. And anytime you see a bank or a federal building that looks like what we think of ancient Rome, or again classical antiquity, it'll have columns and usually be built out of marble. It all refers back to this era, but remember that we're just clumping them together culturally because it's easier, but they are two totally different things. So let's look at some very early ancient Greek artwork so that we can see how all of this evolved. We're beginning with the kuro or kori figures. The kuro are the male of these types of figures, and the kori are the female. These are marble statues, and they're figurative, and they were most often placed above graves. And in general, the male figures were portrayed nude, whereas the female figures were clothed. In Greek culture, we see an emphasis and a fascination with male strength and beauty, whereas the female form was often displayed with a little bit of ambivalence. It was believed that women were more or less ritually impure, whereas men were an example of divine perfection. These statues are relatively stiff and don't look that lifelike, and most of them have what's referred to as an archaic smile. Archaic's just a fancy word that means old-fashioned, because these are considered the archaic Greek statues. The Greek sculptors carved them with a smile to maybe make them look more lifelike. I think to our eyes they look a lot less lifelike because of their smile, and I would even go so far as to say the smile is a little bit creepy. But we can already see that the sculptors of this region were obsessed with the idea of making something look lifelike and achieve perfection. This striving for perfection is evident not only in the artwork but also the architecture of this region, and I would say maybe more than anything else defines Greek art. Here's a closer view of the peplos chores, the female figure that we're looking at, and you can see that compared to the male figure, a lot less emphasis is placed on her body, because again, in Greek culture, the male, masculine, very athletic build was considered to be a sign of divinity, whereas the female body was not. It was treated with a lot more anxiety. Let's look at a little bit of Greek architecture. So you'll probably associate buildings that look like this one with ancient Greece, right? The earliest ways of organizing a building in ancient Greece are referred to as the Doric orders and the Ionic orders, which are used to recognize the different types of columns. So the Doric is the simplest, and here you can see the column is more or less straight up and down with a very simple base. And there are special terms used to refer to each part of the building. The ones that I want you to know the most, because they're the most common, obviously the column is, well, the column, and the top and the base. The base we'll just call the base. The top I'd like you to call the capital, and the capital is what usually contains very identifying features so that you can tell what kind of building it is. So you can see in the Doric order the capital is very simple. And then I want you to know the word pediment. The pediment is the inside triangle on top of the building, and the pediment is important because it usually contains very impressive sculpture. The Ionic order is similar, it's just a little bit more ornate, and as is the Corinthian, which we'll look at later. This type of architecture was most often used to build temples, but in our culture we've appropriated it for all kinds of things. Here's a little way you might be able to remember the columns better with Ionic. You can kind of imagine that the I and the O form the shape of the Ionic column. And with Doric, well, I don't know. Just remember it's simple. That's how I do it. Just briefly, I want you to see this example of ancient Greek ceramics. The ancient Greek ceramics were very, very prized throughout the ancient world because the painters that created them were incredibly skilled, and oftentimes the paintings on the ceramics are an artwork in their own right. There are two main styles of painting the ancient Greek ceramics, which are called the black figure style on the left, where the figures are black, versus the red figure style, where the figures are red. And here you can see it's the same scene being portrayed on both vases. Oftentimes the vases have scenes from Greek mythology or history. This is actually a scene that you might be familiar with. It's Achilles and Ajax. And if you've read the Odyssey, the Iliad and the Odyssey, you'll have heard of this story. And oftentimes vase painters would paint similar scenes as a form of competition. And many of these vases are signed. Some of them are even written, like they say things like, "I made this better than my friend made it. I'm a better potter." They're very interesting and lively. This is an example of a statue that was in the pediment of the Temple of Aphaea in Greece, and it portrays a dying warrior. What's interesting about this is that we see movement and life in sculpture like we've never seen before. And as I mentioned, the people of ancient Greece were fascinated with masculine strength and also with war. We see that in their poetry, we see that in their painting, we also see that in sculpture. But what makes this so uncomfortable? Of course, it's the inclusion of the archaic smile. This is supposed to be a guy who's been shot, presumably to death, but he's grinning as he grasps the arrow in his chest. So we see there's still a little bit of unease when it comes to representation. If you're to cover up this figure's face, the body seems incredibly lifelike, but there are still cultural holdbacks from the archaic area. But we see that starting to fade. So here's another dying warrior. But this here, even though there is still a hint of a smile on his face, there's a little bit more realism to this. But look at the way that the curve of the body has been carefully portrayed by the sculptors. You see a real interest in displaying things as they appear in life. And then moving on to Critias Boy. Critias Boy is one of the more famous ancient Greek statues because this here is the earliest known example of contrapposto, which we're going to see examined by artists for centuries and centuries to come. Contrapposto is a relaxed and natural stance. It's basically a posture in which most of the figure's weight is placed on one leg, and just that slight shift in weight causes a twist that can be seen throughout the rest of the body. So you'll see that it looks like he's putting most of his weight on his left leg, and so then his left shoulder is slightly elevated, and the rest of his body is adjusting for the weight. This being able to accurately represent this stance takes a lot of artistic mastery. Even though it's subtle, to do it well is incredibly difficult. So artists have been trying to perfect this for a very long time. It's argued that Critias Boy, this statue here, is the earliest example of a anatomically, quote-unquote, perfectly lifelike representation of the human body. Whether or not you agree with that, I'll leave to you, but I will say that it seems like this statue here is really the beginning of the ancient Greek perfection in sculpture of the portrayal of the human form. So in the next section, we'll see how this interest in naturalistic representation continues to grow and be built on by artists afterwards, not only in Greece but also in Rome. And that concludes this lecture.